2015 at the University of Cape Town in South Africa, the Rhodes Must Fall movement called for the removal of a statue of a British colonizer, Cecil Rhodes. After 1 month of protests, the statue was removed. A roundtable discussion at the Nordic Africa Days 2018 was dedicated to the colonial structures that still persist within academia across the world.
It continues in the structures of higher education, but it already starts at primary and secondary school. So you still follow a basically colonial structure in what you define as knowledge and how you transmit the knowledge.
Social media is a vital tool in the decolonization movement.
It's really democratizing the space of communication, right? So the Rhodes Must Fall movement in South Africa has, transnational linkages to the Rhodes Must Fall movement in the UK. It has transnational linkages to the Black Lives movement in the United States. And it's forcing these different movements to have conversations with one another.
I think social media has added a dimension for students and to be implicated in actions and inspirations that do not occur within the neighborhood.
It's interconnected, I think, sort of various narratives that speak to issues of power and power imbalances and inequalities across various groups and various conversations.
What happened in Cape Town has inspired movements in other places.
You've got other movements such as the Rhodes Must Fall movement in Oxford. You've got the Why Is My Curriculum So White movement across universities across the UK, basically looking at syllabi and looking at curriculum across the universities and saying, why is it that more women scholars are not elevated and privileged? Why is it that more scholars of color are not privileged and elevated? Why is it that more scholars of African descent are not privileged and elevated?
While social media played an important part in the Rhodes Must Fall movement, the struggle for decolonization is much older than Facebook.
In other African countries, it started way back in the 60s, following the first wave of independence, where African countries felt the need to have an educational system that was well adapted, suited to the needs and the imperatives of the different countries. Countries that have had independence much later, like South Africa, would have a lot to draw on to enrich their own sense of what the issues are and build on the experiences of other African countries.
Rhodes Must Fall in 2015 was not an isolated event. Rather, it built on other rights movements in Africa and elsewhere.
They come from movements in the post-independence area where, students in South Africa were asking for the Afrikaans language not to be used as the language of instruction in schools across South Africa. It's coming from the Black Lives Matter movement. So again, these movements for resistant colonialism, of resistance of white supremacy, are movements that have existed for much, much longer, and they're certainly not something that just sprang out of Rhodes Must Fall or sprang out of a 2015 kind of movement to move a statue.
3 years have passed since the statue of Cecil Rhodes was removed. So what has been achieved since then?
I think we've come a long way. In the University of Cape Town, we have covered mileage. We now have a new Vice Chancellor who is South African and female. And we have different departments working on curriculum change and the transformation. We have conferences and seminars examining just what does it mean to decolonize and to have a university teaching and research that is clearly representative in terms of the silences of history and also in terms of communities that have been neglected because of skewed power relations.
It's forcing academics, scholars, and also policymakers to look at these issues much more seriously because the students are making the demand. It's coming from students, it's very grassroots oriented all the way to the top and not top down.